and welcome to NeuroBetty and Friends, advice for the brain user. I'm your host, Dr. NeuroBetty. I'm a scientist who studies the brain. I'm also a real person, a brain user, just like you. If you're watching this show, then you have a brain, although you may not be quite sure how to use it. Or maybe you're interested in brain research and you need a translation from scientificese to English. Or you just want to learn more about your own brain. Well, that's what I'm here for. I have a PhD in neurobiology. I study brain cells, and I have the privilege of looking at them in the microscope. I also listen to their electrical signals. I'm so excited to show you the world of the neurons. I'll share some of my pictures and brainwaves later in the show. It's not all fun, though. Sometimes it's hard work, and it gets lonely from time to time. That's when I like to come by the Neurotransmitter Lounge and relax with my friends, the brain cells. Thanks for joining us. Pull up a stool. I was just going to order a cocktail. Here's Pons, our bartender.
Hello. So what do you have, NeuroBetty?
Well, as usual, I don't know my own mind. What do you suggest?
You're probably running a pretty high glutamate level, what with this being your first show and all. How about a nice serotonin teeny with a hint of GABA? Shaken, not stirred.
Wow, that sounds like just what I need.
Coming right up.
Folks, I'd like to introduce our friend Wernicke. He's our visual language specialist. He wants to help you, the brain user, learn our lingo. So how's business been, Pons?
Business is picking up. A lot of neurons used to get their kicks off of booze and drugs. To be young and experimental. Well, now they're learning that it's healthier to find their own endogenous highs.
Well, I'm guilty too. Coffee, wine, chocolate, heroin. I'm trying to cut back though.
On the chocolate or the coffee? I know you don't touch the hard stuff.
I'm just seeing if you were listening, Pons.
NeuroBetty, I see you around here so often I sometimes forget you're one of them, a brain user.
Yes, I am a brain user and proud of it. I bet you folks out there are wondering how I can talk to brain cells. They're tiny, too small to be seen without a microscope. That's why we're here at the Neurotransmitter Lounge. It's a special place that exists between our worlds, the world of the brain user and the world of the neurons. In the Neurotransmitter Lounge, we can meet and talk and partake of the exquisite concoctions made by Pons, the interdimensional bartender.
Try your cocktail.
Pons, you make the best serotonin teenies in the universe with just the right touch of GABA. So Pons, where's the queen? Am I early?
Well, there's always some chaos in the kingdom. They should be here pretty soon, though.
Good. Well, that'll give me a chance to answer some viewer mail. One brain user asks, is it true that we only use 10% of our brains?
No, Betty, I think they're coming now.
Those impudent brain users. They call us lazy when we've been working our axons off.
You are overstimulated, my queen. Here, let me blot up that excess glutamate.
You look like you could use a drink, Queen Neuron. How about a shot of GABA?
Queen Neuron, what did the brain users do this time?
The queen is upset. She heard that the brain users say they only use 10% of their brains.
10%? Ha! More like 110%. NeuroBetty, you know that we're giving it our all. We couldn't work any harder.
I know. If you worked any harder, you'd give yourselves a seizure. Queen Neuron, that rumor has been around for about 100 years. You're just now hearing it?
Well, my current user isn't much of a reader. Pity. I used to enjoy Tolstoy.
NeuroBetty, are you going to introduce us to the folks out there?
Princess Glia, where are my manners? These are my friends who live in the brain. Queen Neuron.
Charmed, I'm sure.
And her niece, Princess Glia.
Nice to meet you.
If you don't mind, I'd like to show the folks out there and tell them more about you. Okay then. Each person has a body that is made up of cells that are specialized for different tasks, like muscle cells, bone cells, and brain cells. In the brain, there are billions of cells of two main types, glia and neurons. Glia come in many forms. The princess is an astrocyte, which means star cell. She has a main cell body and lots of finger-like processes that hug the surfaces of the neurons. Queen neuron has a cell body, dendrites, axons, and synaptic terminals. Oh, that's a lot of terms. Let me show you another way. Think of a neuron as a tree. The dendrites are like the branches of a tree. The cell body is like its trunk, and the axons are like the roots. Neurons are connected to one another with their synaptic terminals contacting the dendrites of other cells. They like their privacy though, and there's a small space in between the terminal and someone else's dendrites, the synaptic cleft. The neurons communicate with each other using both electrical and chemical signals. The electrical signal happens inside the neuron. The electricity runs from the dendrites to the synaptic terminals. The terminals release a chemical signal that swims across the synaptic space to talk to the dendrites of the next neuron. That chemical signal is a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitters come in many different flavors that excite or inhibit the neurons or just change its mood a little.
Yeah, I get a lot of customers for those mood-changing neurotransmitters.
The neurotransmitters change the electrical signal in the neurons. Think of it like talking on the phone. The dendrites are like the receiver that you speak into. The sound changes into electricity, which travels through the wires to the next phone, where it's changed back into sound. In the brain, the neurons do all of the talking, and they get all the attention. The glia support the neurons in many important ways, such as mopping up excess excitatory neurotransmitters.
And a lot of other things too. You just haven't been paying as much attention to us.
What would I do without my dear nieces and nephews?
Well, glia are still a mystery to us. Princess Glia, maybe you'll tell us more about your family in another show. Did you know that Einstein's brain had more glia? Scientists studied a special part of his brain that they thought was the math area.
Can we get on with it, NeuroBetty? I must know who has slandered our good name.
Queen Neuron, sheesh, you're still in a bad mood. Have some serotonin, teeny. Well, Queen Neuron, nobody knows for sure, but famous psychologist William James quoted to his fellow brain users in 1906 that we are only half awake. We are making use of only a small part of our physical and mental resources.
I've heard about him. My user was a psychology major. But I thought Dr. James was referring to the potential of our minds.
I think so too. I believe he was talking more about the psyche than about the brain.
NeuroBetty, I agree that most brain users have room for improvement in their minds, but why slander us, the poor, hardworking brain cells?
Well, some scientists believe the rumor was perpetuated by the famous neurophysiologist Carl Lashley, who called some brain regions silent cortex. Then the famous neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield came along. He experimented in the brains of his patients while they were awake by electrically stimulating different regions. He found that some areas responded with a feeling of being touched, while other areas responded by moving a muscle, and other areas responded with a visual image, and so on. But then there were parts that didn't seem to do anything.
NeuroBetty, do they really think we have vacant space? It's more crowded than a Tokyo subway in there.
We are using every nanometer of space we have.
Nanometer? That's 1/1000th of a meter.
Well, right you are. There are about 100 billion neurons and 1 trillion glia. That's a lot of brain cells to fit in your brain case. The brain is a perfect example of making efficient use of space. Let me show the folks at home. I have a model of the brain here. It's pretty cheesy, but it's all I could afford on a scientist's salary.
Yeah, those scientists are lousy tippers. Present company excluded, of course.
Well, let's start with the basics. The cerebral cortex is this big squiggly mass here, which curves around like so. The cortex is the command center. It carries out the higher functions. The rest of the brain is dedicated to functions that don't require much user intervention, such as breathing, regulating the heart, and other survival functions, but also things like emotions. The cortex is very highly developed in humans. It has nearly outgrown the skull. That's why it's all squished like this. Say that this is the cortex. If you unfold the cortex, it would be this big.
How do you fit all that in your skull, NeuroBetty?
It feels cramped sometimes, but we put up with it with the brain users because they can do all these amazing things. But do they care about us? No, they insult us.
Well, I never believed that old story. I've seen it for myself. Look at the brain under high magnification. Oh, hang on. I have that picture that I took with the electron microscope. Pons, could we see it on the viewer?
Certainly, NeuroBetty. Make it so.
Ah, here we have a picture of the brain magnified about 10,000 times. The brain is chock full of cell bodies of the neurons and glia. They're dendrites and axons and glial processes. The black circles, the really dark ones, are the processes of specialized glia called oligodendrocytes.
Now there's a mouthful.
The oligodendrocytes wrap around axons like the insulation on an electrical wire. There's a lot of axons that wire up the brain. Take my word for it, these neurons and glia are jam-packed. There's almost no space between them.
We wouldn't be so crowded unless all of us were important.
Yes, you're all very important, and you all perform special tasks. Cells that cooperate with each other live together in their own neighborhood of the brain.
Show them our neighborhoods, NeuroBetty.
Sure. Well, these squiggles are simply folds in the cortex sheet. The creases are called sulci, and the hilly parts are called gyri.
Are all brains folded the same, NeuroBetty?
No, the folds can be quite different in some people, but the chief sensory areas are pretty much the same. But like a muscle, some areas get bigger with use. For example, the cortex of a trained violinist may have a larger area for finger sensations and movements. Let me show you the touch area, or somatosensory cortex. All the touch, pain, and temperature receptors end up here. Of course, it crosses over first, so this is the sensory area for the left side of the body.
Ooh, are you going to talk about right brain, left brain stuff?
We could do a whole show on that. I find it fascinating. The left side is where language is processed and is thought to be the linear, rational side. And the right brain is the intuitive, creative side. They say that left-handed people have more access to creativity because they make more use of the right side of their brains.
Well, of course you'd say that, NeuroBetty. Aren't you left-handed?
Yes, and I'm proud of being a lefty. You know, the studies show that there are a higher number of artists that are lefty, you know. Anyway, this sort of specialization of the hemispheres